tell us a little bit about how you choose the particular subjects that you use in your representational pieces?
There's a professor of mine later become a good friend in graduate school, a guy named Ron Crotel, that described me years ago to myself as, he said, you're like a crow, you just pick up shiny objects anywhere you see them. And I think that it was probably the best description of how I approach a subject. You know, I kind of go through the landscape or you know, an interior, and something will catch my fancy, and I'll focus down on it and give it a hard look then with a painter's eye. You know, originally it's just sort of the pleasure of seeing, and then you know, you bring those other skills to bear and think about issues of color and contrast and composition. And if those fit together, then you've got a subject matter, is usually how I go about it. But I think the biggest challenge to me has always been, I think the way Pizarro said it, never lose sight of your original sensation. You know, the thing that stopped you the first time, you know, that made you look at the way the light caught the hood of the car or, you know, across the flower bed. If you can hang on to that sensation, then drawing and photography and your own eyes, you know, all work to enhance that and make then the painting distill down to that impression. That seems to be the real wrestling match.
But something that I've noticed, at least I think I've noticed in looking at some of the work, in terms of the color and the subtlety of it, I see, at least to me, a certain suggestion of Cezanne in the work. Was he an influence to you as well?
Yeah, Cezanne's sense of color was a real important part of my development. He modulated form, as you know, not so much with value, but with color. And when I saw that in his work, for the first time, you know, in an original painting, when I got to the museums finally, and was looking at him in the flesh, you know, it was like a revelation to me that here was this beautiful color that was all possible. And one of the problems that we all have when we have a nice library here at the Stifel Center, and you know, we all have books at home that we cherish, but it can only print so many colors, and you know, the human eye can see and mix so many more, and until you're confronted in the flesh by it, a lot of times you don't understand what's possible out there. And so yeah, he had a big influence on me.
As just how conscious are you, in particular, of the visual elements when you're working?
I'd say not at all, quite frankly. When I stumble on it, as I mentioned, you know, in the landscape, for instance, I stumble on a vision of something that catches my, you know, hayfield, a roller bale, you know, some clouds, whatever, real simple, straightforward landscape. I will probably at that point maybe notice, you know, the lines of the composition or lead me off the top left, for instance. And so we'll make a note either on a pad or somehow that, you know, I'll make some adjustments. But the way that I paint is I usually put down, and I think you can even see it here on some of these more expressionist panels, a toned ground, and then on top of the toned ground I'll work in either with a charcoal sketch or most usually just with a darker earth tone with brush. And I lay it out real directly and straightforwardly, you know, so I think of it as the skeleton of the painting. Once that's on, then I'm off and running, and the issues that I'm dealing with are usually, they're all there, you know, color, value, composition, you know, how your eye traffics through the painting. You know, those are all things you have to be aware of, but, you know, it's 25 years later, you know, since I first started to paint, and after that many years of, you know, after that many years of sweeping floors even, you know, you get pretty good at it after a while. So I think I don't have to think as much about those issues. But for me, it's kind of like playing jazz, you know. You have a form that you're working in generally, but once you got the brush in your hand, you're off and running. And you need to be able to react to what happens in front of you in a real now time kind of way. And when you can do that, the juicy part, the joy of painting really comes to life then, because it's process. It's a lot of what the abstract expressionists talked about. That's what they loved in it, was the process. At one point in time in 1976, I was right at the brink of breaking free from representational imagery, and I had the great good fortune to be selected for a scholarship to Hans Hofmann School up in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and went up there as a young man, completely uninformed of the New York school and the life in Provincetown as well, and spent the summer there working. Hofmann, of course, had died, but with some of his students, and that whole world opened for me. You know, the idea of process of non-recognizable imagery, you know, the expressive nature of form. I call it the language of form. You know, the real simple stuff you learn in design class. You know, here's this long box with two straight lines. It's very calm. You know, here's a vertical box with jagged lines in it. It's not calm. You know, that essentially that idea taken to a sophisticated language, and that was the place where I think I took that great leap. And I remember actually I was working on a portrait of another student in the studio, and the fellows kept pushing me and pushing me and pushing me to simplify the form. And they pointed out to me the whole painting was abstract, except I had refused to give up this guy's face. And they said, you know, lose the face, now look at the painting again. And when I blocked out the face, it became just image then. And it still carried some of the weight of a portrait, but without the figure. And that was that was my, you know, moment of awakening to that language. And I call it my angry young man phase. You know, when you're a young student and you're starving for it, so you do everything you possibly can to reach out and get a feeling for what the world is around you and the way other people have experienced it and expressed it. If I'm working with the representational image, a landscape, for instance, it tends to be much less introspective and much more observational. And the problems that I encounter are, you know, how do I make that river look like it's really reflecting light? Those kind of things. And I hope that within those challenges I'm somehow bringing to bear maybe a little poetry to it. But it's a more external thought process, you know, or focused externally. When I'm working in the abstract or in an expressionist manner, those are kind of rarefied moments that seem to vary day to day. I'd have to say that, you know, to answer your question simply, yes, but it would depend upon what was going on that day, what I was carrying with me. You know, the cat threw a hairball on the studio floor, I stepped on it, my foot is wet. I mean, that's an influence, you know, and it's going to make the painting different than if I had gotten up and had a cup of coffee and read the paper and, you know, it was Croatia again or something like that. So it depends on what you carry in the room with you every day.
I don't watch a lot of television, but there's a commercial that sort of, here's an abstract painting, and all of a sudden, here's a car zooming down through it.
I saw that.
I think, especially for beginning and young artists and students, how, or is there any particular way to understand how the eye can travel through abstract work? It's, you know, an altogether other world than the realistic.
It's, for me, it's, I think all the same principles that I had hammered into me, pounded, kicked, whatever the instructor had to do early on, that related to landscaping or to portrait painting or whatever. Those same principles apply to the abstract. For instance, an area of high contrast draws your attention. You know, an area of vibrant color against a neutral ground pulls your attention. You know, lines that converge attract your attention. So, you know, those are some real simplistic examples, but that's essentially how you move the viewer through a painting. And I think the best paintings are the ones that you don't know you've been moved through. But ultimately, there's some elusive quality, you know, it's the drop back and punt, you know, I don't know what I like, but, you know, I know what's art kind of thing. Well, it's not that simple, but there are some things, some paintings, some sculpture that somehow adds up to be greater than the sum of its parts. And that's the artist at work, not only as a technician, and as an intellect, but also as a spirit that's able to bring all that stuff together and convey something that's very basic to human nature.
But there is a third type of subject matter you've been dealing with more recently that I would like to talk about a little bit today, and that's your achromatic works, your black and white pieces.
They appeared in, it's been just a little over a year ago. And they came about in a real sort of spontaneous way. They appeared about the same time that I was beginning to have the first onsets of multiple sclerosis, unfortunately for me. In my case, the disease not only attacks me physically, but it also attacks me cognitively. So I will have onsets that will not only leave me maybe numb in my legs and no feeling in my hands, but I may have real limitations in my ability to think and connect ideas. And so after getting the snot kicked out of me pretty much the first few times of this, I was angry enough about it, I think, which is a pretty normal reaction to something that's like this, that I felt like I wanted to try to be proactive in some way. And what I attempted to do was to try to paint my way in and out of these onsets. And I discovered real quickly that color was beyond my comprehension. It was just too complicated an issue. And I took up a brush, actually, that's around here somewhere, that has bristles on both ends, because even something as simple as two brushes was a real difficult issue. But I could paint with black on one end and turn the brush over and white on the other end, and was able to just make images. They were, I mentioned earlier that I rarely approach a canvas without a plan. Well, in those cases I do. I had not a clue what I was doing. And frankly, after the fact, usually had no recollection, just the vaguest of recollections of the process, which is one of the other issues that multiple sclerosis presents, is short-term memory loss. So they were the tracks, in some ways maybe they're just, the breadcrumbs in the forest trying to find my way back out. But I figure I have nothing to lose, and the more of those tracks I can leave, maybe the greater my understanding will be of this disease and how it strikes me. So in recent conversations, in recent onset, I began to talk about my dog brain, which is kind of a joke, but I think part of what seems to occur is that the intellect and the rational portion of my thinking gets scoured off in these episodes, and what I'm left with is real basic, essential perceptions of the world. It's now time. They're issues of past are just non-issues. My senses seem incredibly keen, and dog, a dog brain almost is a good description of it, because the world I live in is real sensate and not at all intellectualized. And so some of these images, I think, that share human and animal traits usually are done as I enter that state of mind. And I think it's some, shorthand for the process, the loss of one or the awakening more completely of the other. I don't know that it's necessary, maybe awakening is the wrong word, but with the burden off the top, then that sort of animal part that's in all of us has a chance to breathe freely maybe for the first time. My attitude is, you got to spit in the eye of this disease, and this is one way that I can do it. It shakes me around pretty good, so, I'm going to give it whatever I can back. And leaving these tracks seems to, not only give me a little bit of a spiritual lift, to make me think that I'm a little more in control, but I believe I'm learning more about, and I think maybe wrongly, not just about myself, I think larger issues, nature of human experience, I think is maybe, I'm beginning to think is a lot more complicated than I ever thought. I don't know, I don't know what they are. There's a temptation, because some of these have that sort of like cave painting, look about them, to think, oh, you're tapping some old brain thing. Maybe, but I've also, I was an archaeologist for a lot of years, and I've studied art history my whole life, so I have a pretty good, mental vocabulary of imagery. And, I have to ask myself questions, are these images that I'm confiscating from my memory to express what my impression of that time is, that I'm losing my rational thinking, which is in fact the case. So am I using these as symbols, or is it the opposite? Is it the same motivation that put men's minds in that place, I'm encountering by the loss of some of the clutter of civilization, as those things are stripped away from me, do I in fact, like for a moment pass through that same complex of thought processes that was real common at one time, when we hunted and gathered. There's so many issues. Right now, I leave it all wide open. I don't have a clue what's really going on. There's something beautiful about it once you're there. The transition into it is terrifying because it's a type of death every time. But once you're there and you have no longer a recollection of another state, it has to be akin to what Zen talks about, Satori, that living in the pure moment, because that's all that you're capable of. And in that, I think, that's where this whole idea of a dog brain comes to mind, that just immediate sensate world, full of smells and sights. And I wish that I could carry my motor skills and my ability to paint there, but I don't seem to be able to. I can't go there. I can't give up the living moment to capture the recollection of the moment. Find a voice, is what we're trying to do. We have, whatever it is, rightly or wrongly, visual artists are driven to express ourselves in this way. So we do the best we can, and the process is about looking. It's about comprehending the world around us. So we seem to feel the need to leave these tracks, whether it's driven by MS or just by, I can't believe how incredibly beautiful the light looks on this tree today. I need to make a record of that so someone else will look at it and think, whoa, what a day, that must have been something, There, sometimes, the tracks we leave are not pretty ones, the ugly monsters that dwell around us sometimes get caught on a canvas too. So, it's not always going to be, gee, this guy had a sweet life, but I think there's ultimately some kind of human experience there that we can relate to. If the work is good, it'll be human, and if you're human, you can't help but be moved by it. These are a couple of panels that are 2 of 3 of a triptych that'll be in the exhibit. Expressionist came to be in a real direct, sort of aggressive manner. They relate to body of work from 20 years ago vaguely. They don't have any real immediate cousins in anything that I've done recently. There's a variety of sort of casual junior G-man theorizing about, what they are and where they came from. The one thing that, is in fact the truth is that right before the first onset of multiple sclerosis that I had, these paintings showed up just a couple months in advance. So I guess the consensus is, although I'm not sure I buy it, but the consensus is that this was sort of an unconscious manifestation of that disease early on. That before I was even aware, there were some neurological disturbances taking place, and these panels, they're obviously, by scale, this was real common. This is the size and the nature of the work that I was doing when these things appeared. So there's obviously a radical change in everything. The way the brush work is applied, the imagery, it's all different. So the way I was trained, which was you know, the Venetian method, where you work from, and you can see it in this painting a little better. Work on a toned ground, and you put in a sketch, real loose sketch, blocking your darker values, and then you start to work some of your highlights in, and then you glaze them down. And I think some of that's a little more apparent in this painting, where you can see where there's been some glazing and scumbling and whatnot. But it's it was the way I was trained. I was real fortunate to have some professors when I was a young man that had been trained in the old method, and they in turn trained me. And then, you know, your own interests take over, and as we touched on about earlier about Impressionist painters, I was impressed by them. And American landscape painters too. Hopper in particular, I always thought was a really exceptional artist. And so, you know, and then ultimately, you know, you go through all of that and you arrive at sort of the synthesis of all these different styles and ideas, and you just deal with it, you know. And then what's in your hand that you've deposited there over the years of study is what comes out when you want to solve a problem. This is one of the black and white ones that I talked about earlier. It's obviously brown also, and what you see there is just what I mentioned here earlier. That was just a toned ground surface that I had prepared to paint on, you know, in a traditional manner, landscape painting. And when the onset came, it's what was available here in the studio. I mean, I think you've seen these large expressionist pieces, and the landscapes actually, for as different as they are, have something in common in the way the paint is applied and the sense of color. And in this, it's a little tough to look at sometimes, you know, because I see in this sort of lack of control, and this sort of manifestation of something that's other than who I am normally.